Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Patchly Wrong podcast with myself, Randy, and James. And today we have a special guest, Laura, who is also my editing partner in the Story Ninja business that we run. But today we're not going to talk about editing. We're going to talk about homeschooling because she's also mother of three and she homeschools all her children. Welcome, Laura. And so I guess we want to start. We can go through your bio real quick and you can talk about your education and where you started working. And then we'll move into why you decided to homeschool.
I graduated from Texas A&M University when I was 19 years old, graduated with honors, and got hired right away teaching sixth grade English in the town I lived in. It was actually sixth grade was actually in elementary school at the time. They've since moved it to a middle school model, but it was still in the primary school at that point. And I can distinctly remember my principal coming in to work on my first birthday that I worked there and wishing me a happy birthday and asking me how old I was. And when I told her I was 20, she had a panic attack about having hired a 20-year-old, but it worked out. Anyway, I taught sixth grade for 3 years and then I moved on to eighth grade. And during that time of teaching, I met my husband, we got married. And in my last year teaching eighth grade, I became pregnant with our first child. And so I didn't re-sign my contract for the next year. I stayed home and became a stay-at-home mom.
And I'm really interested in, I'll let James pitch in after I get this question so we can get the ball rolling. But I'm really interested in your attitude as a teacher for those 6 years towards homeschooled kids and what you thought of the homeschool process. And then what your evolution to changing your mind is what from previous conversations we had and how that happened. Did you have something to say, James?
I just am very curious about something before we get to that, Randy, which is the intriguing idea of you graduating at 19 from university. How many grades did you skip? How did you get there? That's a pretty impressive accomplishment, and it might inform some of the rest of our story. At least I just need to know. Tell me more.
Sure. So I will attribute part of it for sure to my primary education. I started school in Germany, and I think anyone who's had experience with both systems will acknowledge that the European education system is a lot more rigorous than the American education system. So I was already a year younger when we moved back to the States. I was already a year younger than my classmates, my same grade classmates. And then my teachers very quickly figured out that my curriculum had been at least a grade level ahead of where they were in the classroom, which just made school easy for me and in general. So once I got to high school, I took all of the advanced placement classes that I could take. I took some dual credit classes, and that allowed me, just with those things, I started university with 45 hours of credits, which is the equivalent of about 3 semesters. And then I told Randy's wife this last night. I kept waiting. They kept telling me, in elementary school, they said, just wait till you get to middle school. It'll be hard. And it wasn't. And then they said, wait till you get high school and it'll be hard. And it wasn't. And then they said, wait till you get to college. It'll be hard. And it wasn't. So I took a lot of hours because a lot of it was the university I went to has flat rate tuition. So everyone pays for 15 hours a semester, no matter how many you take. If you're a full-time student, which is 12 or more hours, you pay for 15 hours, no matter how many you take. And I was like, okay, well, I can take advantage of this opportunity. So I did. So I took between 19 and 21 hours a semester to get through more quickly. I also took every summer, I've always been a very big proponent of year-round school. I do it with my children now. And so I took summer sessions, both 2 summer sessions every summer. So I managed to do 4 classes a summer. I took a wintermester, I took a Maymester. That I will say, not recommending a Maymester. That was an entire semester long English literature class in 1 week, 5 days. That was a lot. If I were not such a fast reader, I probably would not have survived that class because you had to read an entire novel and write a paper on it every single day. It was quite a lot.
This answers a question I've had for a while, which is who's the brains in the operation? And between you and Randy, this is now clear to me. But Laura, all joking aside, and also demonstrates something that we've talked about in previous podcasts, which is the benefit of simply being willing to work hard. It may not be enough depending on the circumstances in the setting, but by God, it helps an awful lot. And a combination of not just being able to work hard at first, but to sustain it for extended periods of time can bring you some pretty significant advantages. Okay, so that was very interesting. And I suspect will have informed also your own approach when you were a teacher in school and then when you were teaching your own kids. But we'll get into that. Randy, I interrupted you before, so please go ahead.
Yeah. So I took 21 hours my first semester. And then that first time I tried to go to college, I flunked out because it was too much. So that's super. I already knew you were a hard worker. But that's super awesome. And then I took when I got my master's in creative writing, I took a winter semester for one of my master's level writing classes. And I had to literally write a story every night, read everyone else's story, analyze it every night, write down a comment on everyone's every night, and answer a teacher's question every night for, I think it was 2 weeks long. And I just moved to Italy, so I was on Italian time. So the class didn't even start until midnight or that. And so I spent midnight to 5 every morning doing all this. It was actually the best class I had, but I was so hard to think of a story all day and write it after I was still tired. That's amazing. Good.
No, I was just going to say, I hate to sound like a boomer or an older person, and I know I do when I say stuff like this. At least my kids remind me of it all the time, which is don't complain about working for a few hours and having a headache. Really just figure out what it's like to actually work hard for a while and see what benefits it brings you. And all three of us have had periods of intense work in our lives, it sounds like. But anyway, Laura, this is about you, not me and Randy, and I'm not going to hijack this with sidebars. So back to the question, I think you might have suggested that you intended to homeschool your kids even before you had kids, which must have meant this idea came to you while you were teaching. So here you are inside the system, planning to subvert it from within. Is that because of your experience as a teacher, or was it something else?
So the initial catalyst to thinking about homeschooling was a friend of mine who we went to church together. We were in a small group together, and she homeschools her children. And I was a public school teacher at the time, didn't have any children. And I made a comment that, I would never homeschool my kids. And her response was, then make sure you never pray about it, which is just Christian speak for don't think too deeply about the issue if you don't want to change your mind. And her comment made me, right. And her comment made me realize that I had never thought deeply about the issue, that I had gone to public school. I taught public school, was just the default position for me. And I had never stopped to critically consider the options available and make an intentional. I had not intentionally decided to send my children to public school. It was just what you do. And so that provocation by her made me stop and think about, okay, why do I feel like public school is the right answer? Why do I want to do this? Why do people homeschool their children? Why do I honestly think that they're wrong? Or is that just my bias? And once I had that question in my mind, I started paying a lot more attention. And I consider myself to be a pretty good teacher. With the school that I taught 6th grade in, it was a very low income school. I had students who lived in like campers, like the kind that you pull behind your car. Like that was their permanent residence. They just had a little RV park. There were 24 elementary school campuses in my school district, and my school was ranked 23rd out of 24. So we were not a high academically performing school, a very impoverished school. Most of my students were being raised by single mothers who worked 3 jobs. On multiple occasions, in order to have a parent-teacher conference with a parent, I would go to that parent's work after school or try to find them at home or whatever, because they weren't ever home. Right. They were always, like I said, they were single mothers with multiple children working 2 or 3 jobs. And so you would have to track them down wherever they were in order to have a conversation. So with all that said, my work ethic, I applied to my teaching and I applied it to my students. I expected them to work as hard as I worked, and they did. And so when we did standardized testing and all that, my students' scores came out to be the second highest ranked scores in the district. The only campus that beat us was the campus where all of the gifted and talented kids go. That district had a special campus where if a child was identified as gifted and talented, they went to that. So that's the only campus in the district that beat us. And that made me realize that it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter how poor these kids are. It doesn't matter whether or not their parents are home at the evening. Like, good instruction can get them where they need to be. But with that conversation with my friend and kind of opening my eyes, I started paying more attention. I was very focused on my own classroom and my own success of my students. But then I started noticing the fact that all of the other test scores of all of the other teachers on the campus are the reason that our school was still ranked 23 out of 24. And I started noticing things that were happening, like a teacher who ended up getting fired because she had no grades in her grade book and she just hadn't been teaching the children. They weren't doing anything in her room. Teachers who were just mean to kids. Then later on, Randy's heard some of my other horror. I mean, I have horror stories. There are things like that with teachers. Like I said, when I got to 8th grade, I was put in charge of a team of teachers and I had to review their grade books. And one of the teachers was just autofilling grades. So he would put assignment 1 and then everyone in the class got a 79. And assignment 2, everyone got a 93. And he wasn't teaching. He wasn't grading. He was just trying to not get in trouble for not doing his job. But then I had people who went to jail. One of the women who taught down the hall from me, she's 38 years old, went to jail for having a relationship with a 13-year-old student. And when I say relationship, obviously she was a predator and she abused this child and she went to jail for that. We had another teacher on my campus actually a teacher and a teacher's aide who went to jail for locking an autistic child in a closet. It really opened my eyes to the fact that I was the minority. Not all of the teachers were criminals. Those were the exceptions, but they were there, right? These parents sent their children to school thinking they would be safe and they weren't. But also all of the parents sent their children to school thinking their children were going to get a good education. And test scores consistently showed, not just on my campus, but statewide, nationally, they're not getting a good education. And I knew that from my own experience. I got a good education because I wanted a good education. I taught myself. I would read all of the material. I would read the entire textbook. I would read supplemental materials because I am just very curious and I've always been a reader. And I had a mother who really emphasized the importance of education and would encourage me to do that, would encourage me, get me all of the books I need and encourage me to do all those things. But there's a reason that the majority of students in Texas don't pass the 8th grade U.S. history test, even though the passing standard is 47%. You only have to make a 47 to pass the test. And yet the majority of kids don't pass the test. It's a multiple choice test.
I have been out of the U.S. for a long time, but back for the last couple of years, Laura, and I understand there's a very clear answer to why that is the case. It's because we don't pay teachers enough. If we only were to give schools more money, why then all of our learning problems would go away. All of the other problems that you're mentioning would go away. I say that partly in joking, but that is the only argument I ever hear when it comes to schools. It's always about money. So teachers unions are greedy and couldn't care less about kids. They don't care. At the same time, charter schools are sucking away money from public schools. These are the arguments. I'm not saying this is what happens. And anyone who dares to criticize an individual teacher is somehow a monster because these are the people entrusted with our children. I haven't heard anyone saying any of the things that you just said, which is a good teacher can make a difference. There are many bad teachers. And in fact, it makes it sound like there might even be a lot of bad teachers and that good teachers are in the minority and the learning outcomes are demonstrably poor. So if I was a parent and I cared about my own kids, never mind bigger, broader social discussion or political discussion, what do you think is the reason that parents still, if not happily, then at least knowingly send their kids off to public schools that create such terrible outcomes? I'm sure you've thought about it.
I think there's a combination of reasons. First of all, I think that for a lot of parents, they don't see a viable alternative. First of all, I think that a lot of parents are not sending their kids to public school. You mentioned charter schools. The charter schools are becoming more numerous, and I see more and more kids. There's a really popular charter school in our area that has several campuses, and I see more and more kids all the time in the uniform for that school. So I know that's having a significant impact. And that's a response, right? That's a response to parents seeing that the public school system is not serving their children and wanting to do something differently. I think a lot of parents can't afford the private option. I mentioned this to Randy yesterday. The town where I taught, the private school there, it's a smaller town. There's not tons and tons of options for private school. There was a good private school there. And for kindergarten, tuition was $12,000 a year. That's just not realistic for a lot of families, especially families with multiple children. For me, working as a teacher and having 3 children, I would just be working to send my entire paycheck for them to go to private school. I might as well just stay home and teach them myself. That is literally the math that my husband and I did. That was a big part of our reason. As we said, public school is not an option for all of these reasons. And private school is so expensive that it literally makes the same financial sense to just give up my income. We're giving up my income either way. So are we going to give up my income so that they can go to private school, or are we going to give up my income so that they can be homeschooled? And we chose homeschool. And like I said, I think that a lot of them don't see the alternative of they can't afford private school. If they're two working parents, homeschooling may be a very difficult or even impossible option for them. And I think it's changing more, especially after the COVID lockdowns and parents actually saw the education that their children were receiving. It changed a lot of attitudes. But pre-COVID, and I've heard this from many people, a lot of parents have told me, I went to public school and I turned out just fine. If it was good enough for me, it's good enough for my kids. And that's the same bias that I had, right? It's what I did. Of course, it's what my kids will do without stopping to think critically about the issue, because default positions are very ingrained, and it's not normal for a lot of people to stop and think about whether my default view is the right view.
Not only that, but you are not going to be criticized or challenged or thought weird if you go along with what everyone else does. Even if it
Absolutely.
isn't optimal, people aren't going to look strange at you and say, hey, how come you're doing something different than me? People resist very strongly a challenge, even an implicit one, to the way that they think. That's why they get so angry at each other when they see politically they don't agree on something. It's an implicit challenge to their belief system. So that's why it's so comforting to go along with the mainstream idea.
We have a podcast that you and I did, James, that's going to come out in the next couple of weeks. That's about the difference between attitudes like European attitudes, and Laura touched on this with the German system, and the American attitudes of school, with the emphasis on after school activities and sports and time off and maybe less homework because they got things to do and things of that nature. Also, the other conversation we didn't really have was the qualifications. When you talk about European teachers, their degrees are specialized in what they're going to teach. But I don't think that's necessarily true in the United States. In the United States, you can have a degree, a 4-year degree in just about anything, and then you have to have, depending on the state. I think that's a misconception that a lot of people outside the United States don't understand, which is that the United States is basically like the European Union to a point, with the fact that each state runs their own education system for the most part. And Laura and I talked about this the other day when Obama tried to pass a kind of common core, but it was never required for each state. Each state had to vote it in, and not all the states actually accepted that common core. And I think that goes with the European countries too. I don't think they have a common core. Each country has the requirements for their school instead of the whole European Union. I don't think the European Union agrees on that. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just assuming. But each state also mandates how qualified their teachers are. In Florida, for instance, if you take the certification test in that subject and you have a 4-year degree, you're qualified to teach in that subject to a certain level in the school, I think is the way when I was working with people that were in the school system about 10, 15 years ago. I don't know if it's changed. And then Laura can speak to Texas and other states too.
I can't not speak to other states. I can speak to Texas. And I can speak to Texas when I was 19 and getting my own certificate. I don't know what's changed since then. But yeah, my degree was in political science and I taught English. I did have to I had to take a pedagogy test. I had to take a content exam, and I had to complete about 500 hours of training through a teacher certification program and have a year of supervised teaching to get my certificate. It wasn't just, here you go, take 2 tests like he's describing in Florida, but neither did I have to have a degree in English to teach English. There's definitely questions to be had there. And there was a teacher in my department, an English teacher in my department, whose grammar and emails was so appalling that I was baffled that this woman had been hired to teach other children how to correctly use the English language when she could not do so herself. So there's certainly questions of qualification, but there's also the teachers who are qualified, who do care about their jobs. Even with them, I frequently see a problem of, and I can't remember who coined the phrase, but the soft bigotry of low expectations. This idea that and I would like to clarify that my experience is I intentionally sought out low performing, low income campuses. The schools that I taught at were both among the poorest and lowest performing in the district, because I felt like that was a place that I could make a difference. Unfortunately, you're going to have a disproportionately high number of not great teachers at campuses like that, because it's a lot easier to fly under the radar. It's a lot easier to be a bad teacher when you're at a bad school and go unnoticed. So I don't want to paint all teachers at all campuses everywhere with a broad stroke here, but that was certainly my experience. And like I said, the ones that I talked to who were there to help and make a difference, they still would say things to me like, don't you feel like you're demanding too much of these children? You're giving them too much homework. You're putting too much expectations on them. These kids, they already have a hard home life. They don't have anyone to help them. They have all of these challenges and you're just making life more difficult for them. And I never managed to convert anyone to my view, which is that I'm making their life more difficult today so that it'll be easier tomorrow. Because if they aren't challenged, they aren't going to have a better future than their present.
So let me ask you a question, and that would be, you guys are both talking about the qualifications of teachers, and you're getting into also the attitudes that one brings to the class. If I don't have any of the qualifications at all. I could help my kids with math until they were in a certain grade and then it was done. Or I could help them with a certain subject and then it was done. How on earth am I supposed to, as a single parent, or even together with my partner, going to be in a position to teach the kid not just one subject, but all the subjects that they need to know? I have to imagine that would be one of the biggest hurdles overall, to assume that you just don't know enough yourself, what is going to make you as the absolute layperson. Now, you have the advantage of caring more about your kid than any other person does. So that gives you the incentive. But I don't think we can assume the average person is going to work as hard as you did, Laura, or frankly, going to be nearly as talented as you are in terms of being able to absorb so much. So what's your advice to a parent who said, I don't know, how do you overcome that hurdle?
Absolutely. So first of all, I don't want to discount the fact that I am uniquely advantaged over other people who might choose to homeschool, right? I am a trained certified teacher. I do have experience. I do have those things marking in my favor. And I am not going to try and pretend that doesn't make things easier for me. I also have a network of other teachers I know. If my children are struggling to learn a concept and I'm struggling to find a way to help them be successful, I can contact one of my friends who is still a teacher or who was a former teacher in a different area than me and say, hey, we're having a hard time with this. Do you have any advice? What could I do? That said, as long as now, I do feel like there's a baseline, right? You have to have a baseline level of intelligence. If you're illiterate, you probably cannot teach your children. But there are so many things in place to make homeschooling accessible for parents. Homeschooling is designed for parents to teach their children, not for teachers to teach children. There's a wide variety of curricula available, and for sure in the US, and that's all I can speak to. But we have a wide variety of curricula available, and it varies greatly in how much it asks of the parent. So I have a friend who homeschools, and she knew she wanted to homeschool for all of the reasons of the quality of education and the values that children might pick up in public school and all of those sorts of things. But she's not a teacher, and she had zero confidence in her ability to teach. So she chose a curriculum that is 100% scripted. It tells you, it covers every single subject, all of them. It does health and hygiene and character. It does reading and writing and math and science and history and all of the things. And it's all integrated. It's just like integrated unit studies, and it has teacher manuals, and it tells you, say this to the child. And if the child makes this mistake, this is how you correct it. And if the child makes this mistake, this is how it's very prescriptive. Walks you through step by step. You literally just open the book and do what the book tells you to do. If you have that level of literacy and comprehension, you can do it. It's an expensive curriculum. It's all consumable, and it costs $500 to $800 a year per child. And again, because it's consumable, you can't reuse for a younger child in the future. You have to repurchase for every child every year. But it comes as a giant box that has everything you need to teach your kid every subject for the entire year. So there's options like that available. And then there are many more that are less structured, less rigid for people who like more flexibility, like more creativity, have more confidence to be able to do things.
So this discussion of the full curriculum in a box that you can just consume and apply to your kid is certainly one answer. I get it. Still cheaper, by the way, than sending your kid to private school, of course,
Absolutely.
by a wide margin. It also sounds like, to the extent that it can be automated or fully thought through in that way, it's amenable to the kinds of stuff we read about in science fiction stories like Ready Player One, where every kid has their own little AI-enabled teacher, and you're in at your lesson that's appropriate for your level at that point in time. I wonder, have you had any experience with that sort of automated learning, or is it too soon to say it's just an idea still and we aren't quite there yet? Because from what you just described as a fully developed curriculum, why not then, right? A faster kid can go through it faster. The teacher's always exactly aware of how much they're comprehending, the AI teacher, I should say. And you take parents out of it altogether and just stick kids in front of a screen, which is where they'd probably rather be anyway.
I have not heard of any AI. There are a lot of self-paced curricula. There are online. In I don't know if it's just Texas. I think it's the whole US. There's what's called K through 12 online, which is actually considered a public school and it's completely free. And you can sign your kid up to do it from home. And it's a self-paced online school. I don't know the extent to which they use AI and real teachers. I don't have any personal experience with it, but there are definitely self-paced, do it all on the computer options available.
Okay, so the other questions that occurred to me while you were describing the options for a parent who may not be sure how they would handle this, there are two things that occurred to me. Take them in either order. One is when you were describing the curriculum, one of the words you used was character, and not sure the context, but one of the things that I saw Swiss schools doing when my kids were young, they did their whole education so far here in Switzerland, was starting with kindergarten, preschool. They were not focused on teaching the kids anything substantive, but socializing them basically. Here's how you interact with other kids. Here's how to be polite. Here's how to shake a teacher's hand, making them little proto good Swiss citizens by teaching them the rules of engagement. Do you risk losing some of that by not putting your kids into the lion's den of a classroom and interacting with other kids? That's question one. And question two is maybe, and there's no way to ask this without sounding cynical, so I'll just say it. My experience being a dad, but from seeing many more moms who had the issue, because in Switzerland, it's very patriarchal rule, and usually the moms will stay home with the kids. At some point, they're pretty darn happy to get the kids out of the house and say, school system, please take these children for at least a few hours a day and give me a break. Is it an issue not having a break from your kids in that way? So those are my two questions. How do they learn to develop societal character and learn how to behave with other kids? And what's the impact on the parent who might be worried about not having as much potential free time, even though that sounds selfish, but that is perhaps a concern that might be on some people's minds?
Absolutely. Those are two very common questions and concerns I get for sure. The first one is actually really easy to answer if you've spent any time with a significant number of homeschooled children. And that is that homeschooled children, by and large, are much better mannered than their public school peers because they're primarily socialized by adults as opposed to being primarily socialized by children. Children are much more likely to engage in antisocial behavior. And any parent who sent his child to public school has noticed your child bringing home antisocial behaviors that were never exposed in your household, right? Exactly. All of my friends whose kids go to public school within the first year of kindergarten have come home using vocabulary that is not used in their household, but they learned from their classmates. When children are primarily socialized by other children, and the thing is, you mentioned that the teachers spend the time socializing the children, but the reality is that the children spend time socializing the children, and the teacher spends time trying to undo that socialization. Because I don't know what the ratios are in Switzerland, but in the United States for kindergarten, it's 1 to 24. Or I say in the United States, in Texas, it's 1 to 24, one teacher to 24 children. The teacher is not socializing them. They are socializing each other. And that it is very Lord of the Flies. And then the adults have to spend all of their time undoing the damage done by the other children. When you can maintain a ratio that's much more in your favor as the adults, you can be the primary influence, you can be the primary socializer, and you can avoid a lot of those antisocial behaviors ever developing.
Also, I think for the second part, and when Laura talks about her like schedule and time off and time with them and things like that, you'll see that they're engaged in more activities because of that. And I'll let her say the rest.
I will say, so I homeschool my own 3 children. I also homeschool my friend's daughter, who's my daughter's best friend. They moved at the end of the last school year, and they moved to not a good school district, and her mother didn't want her to go there. And so I offered to homeschool her. One thing that a lot of people who are concerned about all of the things, can I be a good teacher? Am I going to have the patience? Is it going to consume my life? They don't want to commit to homeschool for that. I told them the exact same thing I told her, which is let's try it over the summer. We'll start as soon as school lets out in May, and we'll do it for the summer. And if anyone is not happy with the arrangement, then she can enroll in the public school in the fall, just like she would have normally. And there's not been any compromise to her education. And now we know the answer to the question. And very quickly, I went to dinner with that friend last night, and we talked about how has 2023 gone with schooling? What have we liked? What have we not liked? And one of the comments that she made is how much more polite, how much more respectful her daughter is, how much more emotionally level she feels like she's not having wild mood swings and tantrums and things like that since she's been homeschooling with me. And I 100% believe it's because of that the socialization because I'm the primary person socializing her now, not a room full of 8-year-olds. And that makes a huge difference. And not to mention, when there is a conflict between the children, there's only 4 of them. I'm probably going to know that the conflict occurred, and I'm going to be able to mediate it so that they work through it in a healthy way, as opposed to a schoolyard fight that there's not an adult to mediate, and they don't work through it in a healthy way. They escalate it. They get nasty. They get vengeful. They get bitter, and they carry it over without having an emotionally developed, stable adult to help them navigate a healthy way to deal with it. Your other question was, it's consuming my life, that complaint of parents. And yes, I would agree here. It's everybody I know who homeschools is a mom. I know the one family, the one I mentioned, who does the big box curriculum. The dad does school on Fridays. The mom does it Monday through Thursday, and then dad does school on Fridays. And that's mom's day off. She goes Fridays by herself and goes and runs errands and gets her nails done and does whatever she wants to do that is her own time by herself while dad does school on Fridays. But the real answer to the question is it can consume your life if you let it. And it is a sacrifice. It is 100%. Raising children in general is a sacrifice. You can be, they call themselves like the social media trend. I don't know if you've seen it, the dinks, the double income, no kids. And they talk about it's great. We have plenty of money and no responsibilities. We can go out to the movies every night. We can go out to dinner every night. We can sleep in until 11 o'clock on Saturday. It's whatever. Like our life is ours and there's no demands placed on it by children. This is true, right? Having children, they are going to place demands on your life. And choosing to homeschool your children instead of offloading that responsibility to public schools or private school if you can afford it. And for the record, I'm not opposed to private schooling. I just find it not financially reasonable to pay for it. But if your response is, I'd rather offload this to the public school because I don't want to have to deal with it. And you made the comment, it's going to sound a little cynical, but yeah, it is selfish. That is my view on that. If you choose not to homeschool because your family can't afford to have a single income and you can't actually do a good job of homeschooling your children while both parents are working, that's reasonable, right? If you can't provide your children a quality education at home, then you should send them to public school. You don't want to bring them home and not teach them. But if your sole reason is, then I would have to raise my own children, I don't know how you say that and not be selfish about it. Now you can, like I said, structure your life so that it's not consuming you, that you do get time on your own. I mentioned going to dinner with my friend last night. We spent 3 hours at dinner. We intentionally chose somewhere where there was no wait staff so that we didn't have to worry about taking up a table for a long time. And we sat there for 3 hours and we talked about her holiday, and we talked about my holiday, and we talked about education, and we talked about work, and we just whatever, and had time to ourselves. I think that any mother, whether you have preschool children or you're homeschooling or whatever, you need time. In most families with a stay-at-home mom, regardless of the age of the children, dad goes to work every day. He gets time away from the home, away from the kids to be by himself. And it is important to take that time for yourself. However, do you need that time all day for 8 hours a day, every day while your children are gone at school? Or can you take the responsibility to raise your own children?
Okay, I understand that. And go ahead, Randy.
So what I think the other part of that, though, is we talked about this the other day, Laura, is that you can make your own schedule. You can choose to take 3 months off of the year if you want to go to, if you want to do, I think that's really important. And I'd really like to hear you talk about your schedule and how you do it and how you've seen other people do it that allows you to have a little bit more freedom. Maybe not always away from the kids, but you're not in school 40 hours a week either.
It's not making constant demands on your time, because that's one thing. When we're having school time, the entire time that we're having school time, the children are a full-time demand on my attention. And I can't really get housework or chores or errands or anything else, or my job, my editing job. I can't get anything related to that done during that time. And this varies state by state in the United States. Each state makes their own education laws. Each state makes their own homeschool laws. So it depends on your state, how much flexibility you're able to have. In Texas, we have a very flexible system. So I have one of my friends likes to take huge breaks. She likes to take all of December off, and she likes to take a solid 2-month break in the summer. And so during the school year, they are very much school year, like all day, every day, they're doing school. That's their solid 8-hour block. It's you're not doing play dates with them. You're not going anywhere. Like they're doing school like a full-time job during that time. And then when they have their breaks, she takes off all of December because her family lives out of state. She likes to travel. For the holidays, she likes to just have a rest. I'm the opposite. I like lower stress, but consistent effort. So we do school 48 weeks a year. We take off 2 weeks for Christmas. We take off a week at spring break, and we take off a week in the summer. But that's it. We do year-round schooling, but we only do school 3 days a week. So Mondays, we don't have school. That's my day to do the laundry and run errands and clean the house and do editing work. Wednesdays, we go to Bible study. We're there all morning. And then in the afternoons, it's just everybody's free rest, chill time that I can sit and read a book. I can do whatever. I'm still there. The children are still there. I'm not by myself, but also they're playing games or outside or watching television or doing whatever it is that they want to do and making very minimal demands on my time and attention. And that I do that for me. That schedule is for my benefit because that allows me to do the things that I need to do and have breaks when I need to have breaks without becoming stressed or overwhelmed and feeling like educating my children makes constant demands on my time.
And then on top of that, it's because of your specific attention to what their needs are, you don't have to dedicate a whole school's day's worth of time to get the same impact. Like you can probably fit almost 2 days and like less time than it takes to go to 1 day of school.
Yeah, most homeschool parents I know, for sure, kids who are in primary grades, they spend 2 to 3 hours a day on instruction because it doesn't take that long. And I can even say as a public school teacher, we had 45-minute class periods. We had 45-minute class periods. And if you do your core subjects, your English, math, science, and history, that's 3 hours. And then as far as the electives and extra subjects go, that's focused on what the kids want to do. This observation I made to Randy, children tend to be the excellent children in the activities because they're able to focus more time and attention to it. My daughter, I mentioned earlier, she dances. All of the top dancers in her studio are homeschooled because they're able to take more classes. They're able to come up and do studio time in the middle of the day and get extra practice. They're able to do extra private lessons because they are not spending 8 hours a day at school. And when you think about your child's school day, your child probably takes a gym or a PE class. My children, that's not a part of our school day because they all have activities. They get their exercise when they go to dance or to soccer or to gymnastics or whatever. All of those electives that you're required to take in school, homeschool kids get to pick what their thing is and focus all of their energy there. So a lot of kids, they're required to take gym in school. And then after school, their parents are still taking them to the karate class or the soccer or the whatever. And so they're just getting double. But if they were able to invest that gym class time on the activity they wanted, they could achieve a higher level of mastery at it instead of, my daughter who has no hand-eye coordination having to try to do basketball or volleyball and just getting smacked in the face with the ball over and over. She can focus on, improving her dance.
So I have a practical question for you, Laura. You're making the benefits of homeschooling sound compelling, and things like socialization by adults, which tends to be a good thing, avoiding bad teachers of all kinds, from the indifferent to the downright criminal, the flexibility that you just described for the student, and then ultimately the whole family, ultimately to be able to do additional things and focus on the things that matter. That all sounds great. Maybe you could say a word as to the actual learning results themselves. How do you measure them? Are there standardized tests? Are there objective results externally that we can point to? I hear talks about public schools versus charter schools, but I don't recall seeing too much about what are the objective outcomes for homeschool kids. Do you have the same process for getting into college? How does it work for a homeschool kid that we can measure the outcomes? And maybe I should ask a different question, which is what outcomes are you measuring for the homeschool kid? What's important to you in the process?
Laura, I think
Right.
you should also start with like perceptions of homeschooling from teachers and the public teacher's point of view and things like that too, which is they're not really pro homeschooling for a variety of reasons. And then finish with James's question.
Sure. So I think that definitely there's a negative attitude towards homeschooling and the quality of education that homeschooled children receive in the public school domain. And a lot of that we could spend a lot of time talking about theorizing where it comes from. it's very demonized. Homeschooling is very demonized by the teachers' unions. It's very demonized by the teachers' colleges because, in my opinion, it takes funding from public school, right? The schools get paid by attendance rate. So every child who's being homeschooled is dollars not going to the public school. But also, any interaction that public school teachers have with homeschool children is almost always a parent who decided they didn't actually want to do it and send their children back to public school. And those children tend to be behind because their parents were not putting the effort into the education. And that is absolutely a risk of something that could happen with homeschooled children. They could just not be taught. The good news about that problem is that it tends to be self-correcting, because if you don't want to put the effort into teaching your children, exactly what you mentioned earlier, right? Moms who are like, I just want a break. I don't want to have to deal with these kids. I want to send them to the school. And that's exactly what school can be. For a parent who's not interested in putting in the effort, public school provides you with 8 hours a day, 5 days a week of free childcare. If you don't want to deal with your children, you're not going to keep them at home with you for very long when you could just put them on the bus and not have to deal with them for the next 8 hours. So, like I said, that there are, I'm sure, cases out there of parents who are keeping their children home and just not educating them, and that's awful. But I think that tends to be a lot rarer than public school teachers view it to be, because, like I said, it is a self-correcting problem. You realize, I don't want to deal with this, and I could just send them to public school, and now this is not my problem anymore. As far as actual outcomes, it varies by state. In Texas, it's the STAR test currently, is the standardized test that they take. You are not required to take the STAR test. Homeschool students are not required to take the STAR test in Texas. If you want to participate in public school extracurricular activities, you are allowed to. If you want to play, if my kids want to play on the football team, they can play on the football team, but they have to take and pass the test. That's the trade-off. You are not required to take it if you don't want to do the school activities. If you want to do the extracurricular activities with the school, the UIL, the Universal Interscholastic League activities, then you have to take the test and pass the test. So that's flexible, that's optional. As far as like nationally, home students on average score 72 points higher on the SAT than the national average. They have generally better metrics. They have better college acceptance rates. They have better ACT score rates, things like that are nationally standardized in the United States. And for me, obviously, quality of education is important. There are a lot of reasons that I prefer to homeschool my children, but one of the biggest reasons is that I want them to receive the best quality education that they can. I also want them to be good people. I want them to grow up to be people who have integrity and grit and compassion. And I want to be able to socialize that into them. So I think that both of those things are very strong priorities for me, raising children with good character, but also raising children who have received the best quality education that I'm able to offer them through whatever avenue. As far as like metrics, the curricula all have tests and things like that. I don't know if that's exactly what you meant, but the curricula have tests and things to assess their progress and how they're doing. I don't know if I can be more
Yeah,
clear.
no, it was at least partly the issue of assuming you want your child to learn some stuff. I think we'll come back to the purpose of an education, but it was just the practical question of, okay, does it make it more difficult to get into college? You've got a bunch of schools that have gone test optional, grades you can't count on anymore anyway, because it's not really a signaling function like it used to be. So I'm not even sure how kids get into school at all anymore. And I was just curious as to whether it made a difference for homeschooled kids, but probably not. I just haven't heard much data. I don't recall reading much of that yet, Laura. That's all. So I was curious. But I understand what you're saying about first of all, the test results that we do have, like the SAT statistics you gave. That's interesting. And the point about values is a good one, right? We assume that one of the stereotypes is it's only religious crazies who take their kids out of school, and I'm going to be a Scientologist and teach my kid that whatever they teach them, they don't believe that the public school system is going to provide the same set of values of whatever kind. And I think you put a very good explanation behind that to say, look, yeah, of course I have my values, but some of the values I'd like to make sure my kids learn are things like integrity and grit and passion, which are hard to argue with, right? That's not in any way out there or weird, and it's not something you could take for granted you're going to get from the school system. So parents' personal values are much more easy to bring those over when you're the one controlling the curriculum. Is part of the concern, do you think, and part of the reason for seeking out a homeschooling alternative to have exactly that control, but more broadly now, not just looking at the values, but hey, I don't want to teach my kid about evolution because I believe in creationism. Or how much of that do you think plays a role? That there's an element substantively within the curriculum that you either do or don't want to teach. I want to teach about colonialism and I don't want to teach about dead white men, or I don't know what people get excited about these days, but does that play a role in your experience or not so much?
For some parents, I think it definitely does. For some parents, choosing curricula that mirrors your worldview is important. I I personally, I don't know the statistics. I personally do not know any homeschool parents for whom that is the top priority, but I do know virtually all of the homeschool parents I know consider that when selecting these specific curricula. So that may not be the reason that they chose to homeschool, but they do specifically and intentionally say, for example, I was using the homeschool curriculum I use for reading and for math. I tried out their history curriculum and I abandoned it because it was, I'm no, I guess this is the podcast about having hot takes on things, but it was just such an absurd whitewashing of history. I just couldn't. When it was talking about like some of the founding fathers, they were great men and they did great things and they founded the United States and that's fantastic, but also they did bad things. And when the curriculum was, some people will say that they did things that weren't great, but that's just not true. They were wonderful, perfect, amazing people. And I was like, but what about all that stuff? What about the guy who tried to make slavery illegal in the Constitution, also owning slaves for his entire life? What about the fact that the mother of most of his children was a slave? We have to have, in the era of Me Too, some serious conversations about the level of consent a slave can actually provide. There's a lot of questions to be had here in this conversation, and to just be like, no, he was perfect and he was amazing and he didn't do anything wrong because he wrote the Constitution. No, we need to, for me, like having an honest assessment and having honest conversations is important. And that, like I said, I ended up tossing that curriculum and moving on to something else. So that is certainly, like I said, I don't know of anyone who that's their primary reason. I know that for a lot of people, though, it is absolutely something they consider when looking at the different curriculum options. And I will say that with the current political and social climate in the United States, a lot of parents are choosing to start homeschooling, not because of colonialism or evolution, but because of gender identity and things like that. When you hear more and more about kindergartners being given a genderbread man and explained about how you might feel like a boy, but you're in a girl's body, or you might feel like a girl, but you're in a boy's body. And let's make this genderbread man to reflect the identity that you feel on the inside, and having those kinds of conversations that parents feel like maybe are not appropriate to be having with their very young children. That has definitely influenced a lot of people. That for a lot of people, that is their primary reason for homeschooling, is avoiding those kinds of exposure.
So I think one thing that I know I think she's pretty much talking about the good and the bad, but one of the best things that people might want to consider when they're talking about homeschooling is something Laura brought up yesterday, which is you can go at the pace of your children, where a teacher at the school has to worry about 20, 30, 40 children and has to move forward with the plot, as we say in editing, and progress the plot. And they have deadlines. They have to get through so much. They have to get to the STAR test in Texas, and they have to cover so many subjects. And they can't, if they leave someone behind, they have to leave them behind if they want to do extra schoolwork. And would you talk to that a little bit, Laura?
Absolutely. Pacing is, to me, a huge part of the reason that children struggle academically, because especially with math and language, the skills build, right? If you don't understand addition, you're not going to get multiplication. If you don't get addition and multiplication, you're not going to get algebra. If you don't get algebra, you're not going to get geometry. And I didn't figure out trigonometry until my last semester of calculus. And once I finally got it, I was like, oh, that makes life so much easier. But I didn't ever understand when I was taught them. I completely missed the theorems in trig. I just didn't get it. It never clicked in my brain. And the math curriculum kept progressing, and I kept struggling and I kept struggling. And then finally, I came to an arrangement with a classmate who was really exceptional at math to help him with Heart of Darkness when we were doing a novel study over that. I helped him with that. He helped me with my math. And he finally broke it down for me in a way that I understood. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, now all of these other things make sense. But I was missing this foundational skill and I couldn't move forward without that foundational skill. And the reality of public school, just like it was for me, is that the class moves forward whether or not you've grasped the skill, because the teacher doesn't have a choice. The teacher cannot stay on this topic for however long it takes an individual child to grasp it. The teacher has a schedule and the teacher has to move forward. Whereas in my home with my children and with my friend's daughter, I'm able to assess them daily because it's not, I teach the whole entire class and then I collect the papers and I grade them and I see, oh, this child didn't make a good grade and I hand it back and just shrug and move on because I have to go on to the next lesson. That's, for me, the only acceptable grade in my homeschool is 100. You get everything correct or you don't move on. And all of the children are required to do corrections on every single thing they miss and continue to do those corrections until everything is correct. And I'll sit there with them and make sure you figure out, why didn't you get this right? Let's figure out the gap in learning. Let's fill it in. Let's get everything correct before we move on. And that makes sure that they're not moving on to new skills when they haven't mastered the foundational skills underneath them. And I can go, like I said, as slowly or as quickly as I need to. My daughter is exceptional at math. She is 8 years old. She would be in second grade in the United States. She's halfway through third grade math already because she is able to pick it up very quickly. Some days she gets through the entire math lesson in 10 minutes. And I'm like, okay, let's do the next lesson. We're just going to compress this because we're getting this. We're going to move right along. Versus with reading, it took her a while. She's there now, but it took her a while to grasp the concepts, the phonics principles. She had a really hard time with blending sounds when she was first learning to read. And we just stayed there. We stayed on that same level until she got it. And now she's, I believe, a much better reader for it. She reads well above her grade level now, but she read, all of her friends were reading before she was, because it just took her a while. And I was able to stay there and continue working on those skills and continue working on those skills until she finally connected the dot. And now she has much better reading comprehension than her friends who learned to call words before she did, but didn't learn the meaning of the words. I also have a very stubborn child who's very difficult to motivate. And he's probably one of my biggest examples of how valuable homeschooling can be, because I can tell you, as someone who taught public school, sometimes you have to cut your losses as a teacher. Sometimes you say, I only have so many hours. I only have so many energy. I only have so much energy. I have 150 children in my grade book. I cannot pour the amount of energy into this child that it would take to make him be successful and still have time and energy left for the other 149 children. So if he's not going to do the work, I'm just going to have to let it go. I only have 4 children I'm teaching, and I can pour as much time and energy into him as it takes to help him be successful. He one day just decided he didn't want to do his math minute. It's a 1-page paper that should take 1 minute of math facts practice. He didn't want to do it. He sat at the table for 80 minutes until he finally did it. It was not a big deal. He sat at the kitchen table. I cleaned the kitchen. I made dinner. It was fine for me. But I was able to wait as long as it took for him to get over his stubbornness. If he had been in my class in school, the bell would have rang. He would have gone to his next class and not finished the assignment and gotten a 0. And I would have just said, okay, you get a 0. We're moving on. But instead, he had to keep working on it until he completed the assignment and every problem was completed. I will never write him off because he's my child. He's not someone else's child. He's mine. And his education is important to me. No matter how little importance it is to him, it's very important to me. And like I said, I have, because I'm only dividing my attention between 4 children, I have the time, I have the energy to put as much into him as it needs to get him to where he needs to be and to get him to be successful.
Yeah, this illustrates a principle that we've talked about before and which I use to describe how one can approach issues in business life and private life. And that is, no one cares as much as you do about the issues that are important to you. No one is ever going to care as much about your kid's success as you. And therefore, I predict, Laura, our episode today is going to put quite a few people potentially into cognitive dissonance, because you've just described for the better part of an hour all of the many reasons why doing this is appropriate, possible for someone who doesn't have even training in the area, and also yields better outcomes. And yet most people listening are not going to be homeschooling their kids and are now going to be confronted with, why not? It's really interesting to hear this perspective. I maybe just coming at it from another angle, and that is, a lot of people are interested in creating income for themselves on the side. Can you make some money from this? And not in a bad way, but just to help defray some of the opportunity costs that you, as a full-time or a parent who's devoted themselves to teaching your own kids like this, you've taken on one friend's child. Could you take on two or three more and charge them each a little bit of money and therefore make this less of a painful thing? Do you know of, not painful, that's the wrong word, provide you with some value for the value that you're providing for not only your own kids, but others? You don't want to get up to 24 kids, obviously, because then you're recreating some of the problems of the classroom, but does it work with 6 or 7? And have you heard of anyone doing it in that manner?
It absolutely works with 6 or 7. One of actually the friend who first challenged me on why I wouldn't consider homeschooling has 9 children, her personal children. And she homeschools them all. They're all school age children because she has stair-step kids. So absolutely you can do it. And I would just like to say seeing her and her children out in public is shocking to everyone because they are so well mannered. They're so well behaved. And when you see someone with that many kids and they're all like, I've been behind them in church and they're all just sitting in a pew, still and quiet and attentive. And you're just like, I only have 3 and I can't get them to do that. It's very impressive. And she does not make money from homeschooling, but she does run a business. So she's a work at home mom. I know a lot of work at home moms that do various things, whether one teaches piano, mostly to other homeschooled children. I edit, obviously. And then, yes, you could, if you had people who were interested who said, for example, I would love to have my child homeschooled, but I can't afford to give up the income. I could pay you less than private school, but something. Would you be willing to homeschool my child? That's definitely an option. And I know that's an option some people use. Also, for sure, the curriculum I use and a lot of the curriculum out there was developed by homeschool moms who were looking for something specific out of a homeschool curriculum and decided to develop it themselves and market it and sell it and ended up making money that way. There are definitely ways that you can do that. But I would say the majority of homeschool moms I know don't make any money from homeschooling. I know a lot of work at home moms or moms who, one's a nurse. So she works at the hospital, she has 3 shifts a week, and then the other 4 days she's home and able to do school. So some work normal full-time jobs and then just are able to homeschool on days off. Some like me, like I work from home and I schedule my hours around my children's school day. Some, especially if their husbands have a business, they work for that business and again, just work it around the kids' school hours. But I would say it's definitely the exception, not the rule, to make money from homeschooling. A lot of them work and make money, but not from the education piece.
I think one of the things that you mentioned before, Laura, was that one of the options instead of the curriculum that you teach from home is to put them in front of a Zoom channel that teachers will do for you. I guess that might be a way if you were an expert in something and you got it and you became a member of that curriculum where they were giving Zoom classes. Instead of what you said earlier, James, with the AI, maybe AI hasn't come that far, but they have a teacher that's saying the part that you could have said, but you didn't want to. And so they tell you to do it on Zoom and they go through the exercises with your students that way.
Yeah. And there's also co-ops that you can join. There's tons of, some curriculum are co-op based. So it's set up so that you meet every Monday and the parents in the co-op each kind of divvy out. You're going to teach the reading lesson. I'm going to teach the math lesson. You're going to teach the history lesson. You're going to teach the science lesson. And the parents all meet up and provide the instruction. And then the kids go home and do all of the work and things throughout the rest of the week. I know several of the children in my Bible study do a university model homeschool program. So they go to a private school, but it's a much lower cost private school because it's only 2 days a week. So they go like on Monday and Wednesday or Tuesday and Thursday and receive instruction from teachers. And then on the other days, they're at home doing their schoolwork with their mothers or whoever their grown-up is. Also, for like higher level things, the community college here where I live offers homeschool math so once you get to algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus, all of that, you can enroll your child in the community college to receive that. And it's a homeschool class. So all of the kids in the class are homeschooled. It's high school level classes. For the ones that are high enough level, they can get dual credit. So they can receive university credit and high school credit from the community college. And you can handle it that way if you feel like, okay, because I feel like pretty much any parent can handle that. I say any parent with a baseline level of competence can handle up to 8th grade. Once you get into high school, some of the subjects, especially math and science, can become a little bit more challenging if you don't have a lot of training and experience in it, or especially in science, can require the kinds of equipment that you just are not going to have in your home. And so, like I said, that's where these other options become a lot more appealing. And they're community college fees for these classes. You have to pay for them, but they're not really any more expensive than the curriculum books you would buy to do the lessons at home yourself, and allow your teacher to be taught by a professor at a college setting. And you can feel confident about the fact that, okay, can I teach my kids calculus? Maybe not, but this professor at this community college can.
So I think you started to get into it, and I know we've been talking for a while, so we are happy to have someone with your experience and expertise, but we don't want to over our welcome. But if I could ask this question, you started to touch on it. If you don't have the subject matter expertise, maybe you don't have the equipment. I'm curious how you would describe what you would say are the potential downsides and pitfalls for people who are considering this, just to give it some balance. And then, or if you prefer to phrase it as tips for success for people who are considering it. So what do you have to watch out for, and what's going to help you be successful, whichever angle you want to take to answer that?
So in a state like Texas, that's very flexible, that requires a lot of self-discipline and structure and organization and personal accountability. When there's not someone telling you exactly which days you have to go to school and exactly how many days a week you have to spend in school and all of that, there's certainly the possibility that you can be too flexible, too loose with it, and not keep things on pace, not get through what you need to get through curriculum wise. And if you don't have the structure and organization and systems in place, it's certainly a lot easier for it to consume your life. A lot of the things that make homeschooling work for me, and Randy and I have talked about this, I'm a very neurotic person. I'm a very high level of organization kind of person. I always have been. My color coding and my systems and all of my things are there, and it helps me to be very successful in this. For someone who is extremely low structure and extremely low organization, it could either fall into not keeping up, not keeping yourself accountable, or it becomes very overwhelming and it takes a lot of time because you don't have systems in place to make things easier. And for sure, up front, when you first start, I think that's something that can be frustrating about starting homeschooling, is that you're having to build the systems. You're having to come up with the organization. As you go, you're going to encounter problems, and you're going to have to troubleshoot them and figure out how to address them. You might have to trial and error curriculum. Just because a curriculum is reviewed a certain way doesn't mean it's going to work for you and your family. Just because it works for one child doesn't mean it's going to work for another child. That's, to me, a huge advantage of homeschool, is that you can meet each child where he or she is. You can appeal to the learning styles and the preferences and the interests. But that also means that you might spend money on a top-rated curriculum and find out that it's not working. I tried 4 different curriculum with my daughter to learn to read before we actually found one that worked. And it was a lot of tears and frustration for both of us going through initially. Fortunately, that particular curriculum was effective for all of my children. And so it worked with her. And I said, okay, we're going to start with this with the younger children. And we did. And they both picked it up much more quickly. It was so much more painless. And I was very blessed in that. But that's not how it works for everybody. I've had other homeschool moms tell me, I used this for my first child and I loved it and it worked great. And I tried it with the second child and it was a disaster. And I had to find something else. That can definitely be challenging. And if you're not connected with other homeschool moms, it can feel very isolating and very overwhelming. Like I said, for me, I have that advantage of not just other teachers I know, but other homeschool moms I know, where I can say, hey, I'm having this problem, or I'm looking for this thing. I don't find the neat things that we do. I don't ever find any of them. I'm not on social media. I'm not plugged in on things. But other moms will send it in a group chat and say, hey, I know that you're studying the rainforest biome right now in science, and the zoo is doing a homeschool day studying the rainforest biome in January. Here's the link for it if you want to sign your kids up for it. That's an actual thing that's happening that we're going to go do next month. I would never have found that because I don't pay attention to any of the things, but another mom saw it on Facebook and knew what we were working on and sent it to me. So having that sort of community, having other people who are doing the same thing that you're doing. The Bible study that we go to, it has a homeschool program. Like, it has a program for homeschool kids. So there's over 100 children in the program. school age that are all homeschooled. So my kids get to go and be with them on Wednesday mornings and see there's all of these other kids who also were homeschooled. Like, it's not just me. We're not the only ones. We're together, and all of their moms are there with me. And I'm like, yes, it's not just me. When you feel like you're the only person struggling with a problem, it can feel very isolating. So like finding other people, building community with that is, first of all, it can give you tips and tools and way to overcome it, but it can also just make you not feel alone in that. So I think that's very, very important. And those are the main ones I can think of. I don't know if there's any other that you can think of that might be an objection someone might have or a struggle.
No, you've covered a few things over the course of the session. The one we discussed earlier on was, of course, if someone doesn't have the financial wherewithal to not work, or it appears that way, then that might be a stumbling block. But I think I would say this has been a thoughtful and careful discussion of elements. It certainly left me with a positive impression of the benefits of homeschooling. And of course, like anything in life, it does come with in the sense of effort and work and opportunity costs. But at the same time, it's possibly, if not one of the most important things that people will ever do, right? Do you raise good children to have good values and to be good members of society? This is one of the ways that you can take an active hand in doing so. So I'm happy that we had this opportunity to discuss it in such detail. Is there anything else, Laura, that you wanted to mention that we have not covered about the topic of homeschooling that you would like to get out there? We'll hit you up for a few links and other references that you found most helpful, so we can include those in the show notes for someone who's curious about looking into this. Anything else that you'd like to leave with listeners and watchers before we end?
I would just say that I have found it personally to be a very rewarding experience. It feels really good to be able to be aware of your children's education and progress, and to know that they're getting what they need. I have the majority of my daughter's dance friends, even though I said the top dancers in her studio are all homeschooled, still the majority of girls who dance there go to public school, and seeing them struggle with frustrations over teachers who assign work that the parents feel like is a waste of time, or that was not adequately explained, or a child is struggling to grasp a concept. And when you've delegated that responsibility to the school, you feel like it's the school's job to fix it. And you feel frustrated when it doesn't happen. And you feel frustrated when your child is struggling and not being successful, and you are unable to slow things down or make things work in a way that works for your child, or vice versa. Randy's wife mentioned yesterday being really frustrated because she was very academically successful and gifted, and she felt like she spent half of her school year just sitting there waiting for the next thing to happen, because she had already completed the assignment, she had already grasped the lesson, and she was ready to move on. But unfortunately, the class wasn't, and it just felt like a giant waste of time for her. And being able to orchestrate all of those things in a way that works for your child, that lets your child achieve maximum potential and be successful, is really valuable. A lot of things that I read as a teacher and going through teacher training about development, child psychology and development, and how all of that works. People, but children especially, can only be successful within their proximal zone of development. And when things are too hard or too easy, the child disengages, and you're not having a successful learning environment anymore. And being able to put your child in an environment where you really are able to set them up for success, I just think that's a tremendously valuable thing. And it does come with a lot of costs, but it's a huge benefit.
One thing we didn't ask, maybe this is the last question. By taking over the education of your children, are you learning a lot of stuff that maybe you overlooked as in your education? I know they're really young right now, but does that happen now? And do you think that'll happen in the future? Hey, we're going to talk about this. And you're like, wow, I didn't take a really good college class on that, but now I've done all my research. Are you part of the learning process?
I feel, for example, my brother is a giant nerd, just like me. And he made up a U.S. history trivia game for us to all play on Christmas Eve. And so we all sat at the table and played this giant trivia game he had constructed over everything from the early America, the colonial period, up until the Golden Age. And I realized that all of the things that I've already covered with my children, like I knew all of the answers, I was able to crush it. And then the areas that I haven't covered with my children, my accuracy was less. And it definitely has caused me, and I know this again from teacher training, that when you teach something, you retain more of it than when you are being taught, which is why it's always encouraged to have children be able to like get in front of the class and give a presentation, to teach a piece of the lesson, to do those sorts of things because they take ownership of the information. But I have definitely found that for me as well. I'm taking ownership of information that maybe I was less attentive to or that I had since forgotten because it just wasn't applicable to me as an adult. So I feel like, especially in science and history, those subjects that I don't necessarily use on a daily basis, I've definitely learned things. I have been refreshed on things. It's been very interesting. I think that's definitely part of what I enjoy about it is it's very intellectually stimulating for me because as I'm preparing to teach them, I'm also learning things.
Excellent side benefit and a good way to end. I like that. And it was great having you on, Laura. I've heard a lot about you from the other work that you and Randy do together. But I think more for the benefit of our listeners and our watchers, this was really a great introduction and in-depth dive into the world of what homeschooling is like. And so I'll say thank you very much. Thanks everyone for listening. Tell us what you think. Tell us if you're doing it. Tell us if you're thinking about it. And yeah, we hope you had a good time. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Laura.
Bye.
Bye.
We'd love to hear what you think. So please comment on the show with your thoughts. We read all of your comments.
Thanks for joining us and thanks for subscribing. See you next time.